principles of follow-through and overlapping action determines and helps establish a sense of three-dimensional movements within inside of our characters. If you take a step back and think about it, our character, our mass itself, moves through a scene, but not all of the parts and pieces of our mass, of our character, begin and end their movement at the same time. The principles of follow-through and overlapping action help define when certain objects are going to start and stop their own series of movement and how. Let's take a look at some examples of how follow-through and overlapping action can support our animation. If you take a look at this little whip animation, it does a really great job of applying follow-through and overlapping action to create a wonderful sense of fluidity within the movement itself. If you look carefully here, you can see that the wrist, that whipping motion, has its own series of keyframes and its own timing, and then the tail of the actual whip is following and it's trailing. It creates the idea that the tail is lighter, the wrist generates the movement, and then the tail is kind of following that movement, and it's concluding and settling at its own time after its own understanding of its weight and its depth. Follow-through and overlapping action facilitates the conclusion of all of these different parts, because each one of them is going to have their own timing and their own spacing within inside of the animation itself. If we're careful and we apply this principle correctly, we can create a wonderful sense of fluidity. In addition, follow-through and overlapping action emphasizes the weight of all of the different parts and pieces. Here we have an animation of a man swinging on a rope. And if you look very carefully here, you can see that the appendages, specifically the legs, have their own sense of timing, their own sense of weight. As the animation plays here in a second, watch what happens to our character. He goes up, but then his legs flip out, which is very cool. It emphasizes the weight of the central mass of the character and the weight of the legs. By having the legs follow through and overlap their movement with the central mass, we've given them their own sense of weight, their own conclusion, and their own timing within the larger context of the animation. This is follow-through and overlapping action. All the parts and pieces of our character are moving at different speeds and at different time. The weight determines that speed and that time. So this principle does a really great job of emphasizing the weight inside of our character's animation. In addition, it also helps us create a believable action inside of our three-dimensional scene or inside of our two-dimensional scene, because we have a big job as animators. We have to take these two-dimensional drawings and infuse them with life. The principles of follow-through and overlapping action start to remind our audience of this wonderful organic world that we naturally live in. We're not robots. Nothing moves in linear straight lines. Everything moves along its own arc. And the pieces of that movement are going to have their own speed. If you look at this animation very carefully in front of you, of our little whip, our little tail, if you will, of a dog, you can see pretty quickly that there's really three parts to this animation. There's the base, the middle, and the tail, the end of the shape. Each one of them have their own series of poses, their own series of timing, and their own sense of weight that's established by the arc and the change of that arc going across the animation itself. Follow-through and overlapping action do a fantastic job of creating this organic sense of movement and then representing it on the screen just quite wonderfully. We should be looking at every opportunity to be infusing our animations with the principles of follow-through and overlapping actions. It's going to make our audience feel that our characters are full of weight, flexible and fluid, and full of life.